In this video, we're going to show you to install the Upstream O2 sensor on your Jeep Grand Cherokee located above the catalytic converters. Now there's going to be two sensors on either side of the engine. The process will be similar for both sides, but on the driver's side, it's going to require the removal of the front drive shaft. On the bottom of the splash shield here, we're going to remove the three 10mm bolts across the front. There's a plastic retainer button right here. You can use our trim tool. Pop that out. On the sides here, we have a 13mm bolt. Ours has been replaced, so you want to use whatever size socket required to remove your bolt. And we're going to do that on the other side as well. On the back side of the splash shield, there are two 13mm bolts here. Loosen and remove those. As we remove these here, the cover should start to drop down a bit. Go ahead and grab that, pull it out, and set it aside. And we're going to hop into the vehicle. Put the vehicle transmission in neutral. Now that you have your vehicle's transmission in neutral, you want to go ahead and disconnect the ground terminal on your battery. To access your battery, you want to go and open up the back passenger door, slide the passenger front seat forward, and access this panel right here. Put your hands underneath this little flap and lift up. On the front side of this panel, there's going to be two more clips further up. So slide your hand up underneath and pop those up. Go ahead and remove that panel and set it aside. We're going to use a 10mm socket to loosen the ground terminal here. Go ahead and wiggle that terminal free. Now if you reach around the back side of the intake, the connector is on the back side here. Has 4 wires going into the back side of it. And this is it right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a pair of pliers with hooks on them, like a hose plier, and we're going to reach in there and pinch the connector and release it because it's really, really tight to use your fingertips. We're going to go ahead and disconnect that connector. Pinch on the tab. Pop that out. We're going to remove our transmission splash guard here. There's normally 4 1/2-inch bolts. There's one here. There would normally be one right over here, but ours is missing. Go ahead and remove the 2 on the back side. Using a 16mm socket, we're going to loosen and remove the 4 bolts for this bracket. Now I'm going to use our jack on the transfer case itself. Now what this is going to do is literally just support this. I'm not jacking up the vehicle by the transfer case. When we go ahead and remove our transmission cross member here, we don't want this to fall down. That would be bad. So just put your jack underneath the transfer case here. You can put it on this side here, use a block of wood, and just support it there. Remove the 3 bolts on the side of the transmission bracket. Go ahead and use a 16mm socket for this. Move the bolts on the passenger side. Go ahead and use a 16mm socket for this. Go ahead and use a 16mm socket for this. On our bracket, we have two 15mm nuts on the transmission mount itself. This last nut here is the only one holding this bracket in place. Remove that, hold the bracket. And once you get that off, go ahead and remove this and set it aside. Before we separate our front drive shaft, you want to go ahead and mark it in the position so when we reinstall it, it goes together in the same exact location. When we mark this, we're going to repeat the process for the front portion of the front drive shaft. I'm going to mark here. We'll do the same for the front. And we're going to remove the Allen bolts on the rear of the front drive shaft first. We're going to use a number 8 Allen. Now once you get your bolts out, you want to go ahead and tap around the edge here and separate the rear unit from the coupler here. Now the reason why we did the rear first is what we can do is we can bring this up and secure it up here. That's going to give us a better angle to get to the front Allen bolts on the front part of the drive shaft. Now we use a securing strap to wrap around the drive shaft up and over the back part of the transmission area here and brought it back around the other side and hooked it onto the transmission mount just to hold this up and out of the way. We're going to disconnect our securing strap. Bring our drive shaft down. Before we remove this here, I'm going to go ahead and mark this as the rear. And this is the front. There we go. Pop that out and set it aside. Our heat shield is held on by a couple 10mm bolts. And we have one more on the upper back portion here. I'm going to follow this up, locate your O2 sensor, and we're going to disconnect it from that little retainer clip. And once you separate that from the clip, you're going to push down on this upper tab here. You can reach up there, pinch and pull the two connectors apart, like so. And use our 10mm and our extension with our ratchet. Now that we have that loosened a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and do the same on the other lower bolt. Now to access the upper forward bolt on the pipe here, we're going to go up behind the AC compressor. We're going to use a standard 10 millimeter deep socket on our longer ratchet. Go ahead and break that free, and we will remove the 2 upper bolts. Go ahead and pull this one down. We have this one out. Let's go ahead and remove the upper rearward bolt now. Now that we have the upper rearward bolt loose, I just have my extension and socket on there. Now you're gonna have to work with a concoction of sockets and extensions because the ratchet will hit the exhaust pipe or it'll hit the steering shaft. So you have to get just that right mix to get that out. There we go. Now at this point, we got the 2 lower bolts loose, upper bolts out, but we still couldn't separate the pipe from the head. So we're going to remove the 2 lower bolts. On our exhaust flange here, we have 2 13 millimeter nuts with the spring tension hardware. We want to go ahead and loosen and remove these nuts. Good to remove that nut and spring. Let's go ahead and give this a few taps. So our pipe is separated here as far as it's loose with the gasket. Let's loosen the bolts here. This is for our exhaust hanger. Go ahead and use a 13 millimeter socket for these. On the passenger side, we have our passenger exhaust that comes back to our spring bolts here. Want to go ahead and loosen and remove these nuts. Go ahead and use a 13 millimeter socket for these. Once you have that one there good and loose, let's go ahead and do the same for the upper. Now that we have both of the nut and spring sets loose, you want to go ahead and remove those and set those aside. Now once we have our spring and nut hardware removed, we can go ahead and push on the exhaust and separate these here. Grab the pipe, slide it forward, and then down and out. Now we're going to use our 22 millimeter wrench. And you want to go ahead and unthread our O2 sensors. Now if you're replacing one, you normally want to replace the 2 of them. This is pretty much the best way to go ahead and get to the upper one. Now the inside of the flange here, you want to make sure that this is clean of any debris, things like that, so that it'll have a clean mating surface between the gasket and the cylinder head. I'm just going to use some 400 grit sandpaper on a block of wood. The reason why we're using a block of wood is that we just want to make sure that it's a nice smooth surface. We don't want to gouge or groove any of the steel. Once you have that cleaned up, spray solvent, give that a wipe, inspect it. Everything feels good. When installing your O2 sensor, you want to make sure you have a little bit of anti-seize compound on the threads, but do not get any on the sensor itself. Install that and start to thread that in. Now as you rotate that in, make sure you rotate the harness with it as well. And once you have that sensor bottomed out, you're going to feel that gasket crush underneath and seat. You want to make sure that you go a little bit further to seal that. Check around the perimeter, make sure that that gasket is fully seated. Ours looks good. I'm going to take our gasket and we're going to put in one of the bolts. Get this lined up. I'm going to just thread that in just a few threads. Now the gasket itself has little eyelets on there, and the bottom of our cat pipe is slotted. So the plan is to go ahead and feed this up and in, and then drop the cat pipe onto the two lower studs. On the flange side of our cat pipe where it bolts up to the mid resonator there, there's an O-ring here, a donut. Now normally you want to go ahead and chisel this off, pop it off, and replace it with a new one. Our particular unit here is in good condition, and for video purposes we're just going to reuse ours, but you do want to go ahead and replace this donut. Once again, pop it off, clean it, put on the new one, and then you'll have that ready for installation. Go ahead and feed your cat pipe up and in. And what you want to do is try and get that pipe lined up so we can slide it down on top of those two lower bolts. And there we have it there. Our next step is to get the pipe on the mid pipe lined up on the flange. Okay, we have the forward upper bolt installed. Rear upper bolt threaded in. Let's go ahead and snug those down gently. I'm going to go ahead and get the lower bolts. Now the upper rear bolt here, I'm just going to go ahead and run that in as far as I can by hand. All right. And then I just switch over to my ratchet to go ahead and snug that one down. I was able to pop my gear wrench onto this here to go ahead and run this down a little bit. Okay, snug that down. I want to torque down these bolts to 17 foot-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and repeat for the other three. Now on a passenger side exhaust flange right here, I'm going to put some anti-seize compound on the studs. And what you're probably going to have to do, at least for us, we're going to have to push on the exhaust forward. It should be enough to get that flange lined up and get that nut started. Now I'll try and snug those down just a little bit. We're not going to make them super tight. We just want to get these on a few threads, and then we'll install the springs and nuts on the other side. Put some anti-seize compound on these threads here. Just go ahead and run these in a little bit. These springs and nuts are both bottomed out, so let's go ahead and tighten down the passenger side. And at this point here, both of our flanders are tight. Go ahead and install our support bracket here. Get these bolts started. Just want to make sure those are good and snug. So once they're bottomed out and they're tightened down, just give them a little bit more. Just take our Upstream O2 sensor. We're going to feed that harness up. Take that connector, bring it up, plug it into the harness. You can hear it and feel it snap into place. And press that back onto the plastic retainer up top on the side of the transmission. You're gonna place your heat shield up into place. Line that up. I'm gonna get the two lower bolts started here. Just have to move that heat shield around a little bit to get that bolt to line up. I was able to push the bolt through the heat shield, see where it came out, and then guide the bolt into where it's threading into. So I'm going to thread that in as far as I can by hand. Snug that down. And our heat shield is kind of in the way of our drive shafts here. So we're just going to go ahead and push that up to maneuver that, make clearance for our front shaft here. Now we're going to install our drive shaft here. I went ahead and when we had started this here, we had the yellow crayon marker and we marked the front diff where this was to line up with. And I also marked front on this here so I knew which end went where. I want to kind of get this lined up. And our goal is to start getting some of these bolts started. So I'm just wiggling this back and forth gently to get one of these bolts started. Now with one bolt started here, we're going to go ahead and pop the back half in. So I have the yellow mark here, lines right up on our transfer case. So we know that we have this lined up. Go ahead and pop that into place. And then we can pull it out a little bit. Now we're gonna line up our yoke right here, line up the crayon, and if we look, our bolt holes line up pretty good, exactly where they're supposed to be. We'll do the same thing here. Just gonna go ahead and get a bolt started. Now at this point here, it doesn't matter how you do it. You want to go ahead and install your bolts and your couplers here all the way around. Do the same on the front. And then you want to go ahead and gently snug these down. So the reason why we're doing this by hand first, we don't want to put power tools on this here, is that for some reason, if one of these should start to cross thread and bind, well, we don't want to ruin a flange. So we start them all by hand, and then we'll come back, we tighten them down and torque them into place. Now that we have all of our bolts in on our rear flange as well as the front, now what we want to pay attention to is as we tighten this down, it's going to suck the drive shaft unit here into this flange, and you want to pay attention to how you're doing that. So what you want to do is normally tighten one side, tighten the other. So you're going to do it in a star pattern, so you evenly pull this in flush. Otherwise it'll be crooked, you'll end up with a drive shaft wobble, and you don't want that to happen. Now before we torque these down, you want to go ahead and grab something to secure this, because right now we're in neutral. We can't put it in park because we need to go ahead and rotate this here and torque the upper ones as well. So we're going to use this type of securing strap. This is a rubber strapped wrench per se. Feed this through. Now you don't want to grab the drive shaft with a big pair of pliers. You can crush and damage that drive shaft. That's why we're opting to go this way here. Let's go ahead and torque these down to 41 foot-pounds. Okay, let's go ahead and do the same for the front. All right. Now that our drive shaft is all torqued into place, we can go ahead and remove our strap. I'm going to bring our cross member up here. We're going to install the two nuts onto the transmission mount. And this will kind of hold it in its general area. I'm not going to tighten these. That'll give us some maneuverability to go ahead and get everything else lined up and installed. We have our 3 bolts on the side over here. Let's tighten these down. You want to make sure these are good and tight. Go ahead and repeat for the passenger side. Line up our cross brace on the driver's side here. Get these bolts started. Let's go ahead and tighten these down. ahead and tighten down our transmission mount nuts here. You just want to make sure all of these are good and tight. At this point here, we can go ahead and start to lower our jack. And remove that. Install your lower splash shield. The front portion of the shield fits on top of the front of the cradle here and almost latches in. Push this up into place. And install the bolts. Now there's normally 2 on the front here. Ours is missing 1. Should be 1 on the left side here, but we're installing our right one. And then we have our 2 on the rear. Go ahead and tighten these down. Install your front tray. You're going to tuck it inside of the fender liner on both sides. I'm going to install our bolt here. Once we get this one started, we'll install the one on the passenger side. That'll hold the tray up into place. Install our 2 rear bolts. I'm not going to tighten those down yet. Let's go ahead and install the bolts and plastic retainer across the front. Tighten these down. Now this is a plastic skid shield. You want to go ahead and make sure that these are nice and tight. I'm going to go ahead and do the same for the back. Let's go ahead and snug this down here. And do the same for the other side. Line up your O2 sensor from up top here. And once you have that lined up, press it on. Take your engine cover, line that up with the oil fill, press it down on top of the ball studs there. Reconnect the ground terminal, slide that down into place. And let's go ahead and tighten down the terminal nut here. Make sure that's good and snug. Give that terminal a little wiggle, make sure that is locked on pretty good. Let's now go ahead and install the lid. Now on the bottom of the lid here, you're gonna have 4 of these little tabs here. I wanna go ahead and line those up. Once we get the 2 front ones lined up, it'll make it easy for the front ones to line up as well. Snap those down.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.